All right, we are officially recording, so let's go ahead and get started here. All right, so today's topic is the church, basically in general, right? So I have a few what, who, why, how things here, right? So what is it? Who can give me a good definition of what the church is?
It's a gathering.
Literally speaking, that's what a church means, right? It's a gathering, right? It comes from the Greek word ecclesia, which really means gathering for a particular purpose.
Which is to,
In this case, worship, right? So sure.
And tell me if I'm wrong, but like my heart says Jesus. Is
Well,
he
okay,
a church?
that might be the second question. So right, so what is it? It's the people. Primarily that's what the church is the people, right? Everything is directed towards the people. And we do that in particular ways, right? But also it's a human institution, it's governed, right? We understand it's guided by the Holy Spirit, right? And in that respect, we kind of have two aspects that we talk about a little bit in Lectio. We have the invisible church where the Spirit guides our hearts. We have a unity in faith and belief. And then we have the visible church, humans, right, that make it up. And so because it's a human institution, we do have what we call a hierarchy. Now, it's not a typical type of hierarchy that you would imagine for like a corporation. So it's not necessarily a top-down hierarchy. It's actually a hierarchy of service. So with that being said, at the top of the hierarchy would be the lay people, common people, you, right? They're at the top. They're the ones that are most served or should be most served by the church, right? Underneath them, you have, well, sisters and brothers, you know, those that maybe take a vow and they have particular mission or ministry within the church. Then you have monks and nuns, and there's a difference. Monks and nuns' main charism is to pray for the good of the people, right? A lot of them live in what we call cloister, right? They live not necessarily out in the world, they live separately.
how are sisters different from nuns? Because
Yeah. So sisters actually have a mission in the world. So maybe like they teach or they work in hospitals or ministries of the poor, right? They're actually on the boots on the ground working with people directly.
Okay.
Nuns, their mission is to, in a more of a spiritual way, to pray for the people, right? And they live usually in convents or monasteries.
So they're not as visible.
They're not as visible.
Not as tangible.
I would say, right. So for instance, we have a word here called the Pink Sisters. The Holy Spirit Adoration Sisters. They're up in North City. They have a convent up there. They don't go out. You can go there to see them, but they don't interact with anyone in the world. They're actually separated apart. If you were to go into like their mother house, they have like what they call a gate or a grid that separates them from the rest of the world.
So are they a nun?
They're nuns. Nuns. They're nuns.
Is the term interchangeable?
No. Sister is someone who has, so like sister is a mission. So like, let's say.
But you just said their name, the name of their place was like Sisterhood or the Pink Sisterhood. The Pink Sisters.
Well, their title is the Holy Spirit Adoration Sisters.
Okay.
But
I guess
they're
I
not,
heard the same
yeah,
thing
they're
she
not,
did
they're
of, like,
not,
the sisters.
they're not really clearly sisters. The sisters would be someone that takes actually a vow, right? That term generally uses someone whoever takes a vow toward, and usually they're the evangelical vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, right? But there's difference in kind between a sister and a nun. A nun is primarily separated from the world, prays for them. A sister has a mission or charism within the world. Amelia?
So if I'm a nun and I decide that I want to go out and help the world, could I actually do that? Or would I
You would have to get permission from your superior. And if you want to join another order, you have to actually get permission from their superior too. And maybe even the bishop of that particular area. So it's not like an easy like switch over thing, right? Because you take a vow for that particular reason. So you actually pledge obedience to the order. as I pledge obedience to the bishop, right? So I can't just go over to Belleville. I'm a Belleville priest now. I can't do that.
So when Amelia went to Sacred Heart Villa, there
Mhm.
were
Sisters.
sisters.
Mhm.
And was there?
They may call them nuns, but they're not nuns.
Okay, so those are, so
Those are
like,
sisters. Properly speaking, they're sisters.
the ones at Port Jesu would be
Sisters.
Okay. What was in the Gabriel house? Were those nuns or
Sisters.
sisters?
Sisters.
Okay.
Those were school sisters of Notre Dame.
Okay.
Now, it gets kind of tricky because certain orders have both kinds. So like the Carmelites, for instance, right?
Yeah.
Carmelites have sisters that go out to the world and help people. And they also have a monastery of Mount Clayton where they're actually separated from the world, right? So that's the distinction though, what their mission or what their charism is, right? That's how we know the difference. But colloquially, they'll be used interchangeably. But
Yeah,
that's not,
some people are
but
like,
that's,
oh, well, they're
right,
nuns.
but that's not
Maybe
proper.
call them sisters.
That's not proper, right, yeah. Okay, so after brothers, sisters, monks, nuns, you then have deacons. And there are two types of deacons. Now we're talking about the ordained state, right? There are transitional deacons, those are becoming priests, and permanent deacons, those that stay deacons, right? We have Deacon Dave as a permanent deacon, right? We then have priests, monsignors, bishops, archbishops, cardinals, and at the bottom of the hierarchy is the Pope.
What exactly is a Monsignor? I get that he's in
Yeah.
between, but
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we can probably cover this now. So Monsignors, so we have two Monsignors here, Monsignor Simon Shamlover. Father Mark, what's the difference?
It's an honorary title.
It's an honorary title.
oh,
Essentially, there's no difference, right? That's a title given by Rome for a particular honor because of the mission they've done for the church in some way.
not based on age though.
Well, there used to be a requirement, you had to be at least 35 years old. Now it has to be at least 65 years old.
35 is young.
Yeah. Well, when you get ordained at 26, that's, but now it's 65.
To be a Monsignor?
Mhm.
Oh, okay.
The Holy Father made that change just recently. The reason he made the change because his idea would be, well, if you're good enough to be Monsignor, you should be good enough to be a bishop. I don't know if that's right or not, but hey, the Holy Father made the call. So fine.
There's
So-
no difference really between a bishop and an archbishop.
No.
It's just the type of.
Right, the type of place they're governing. So the bishop is the head of a particular diocese. An archbishop is the head of a particular archdiocese.
Which is what St. Louis.
St. Louis Archdiocese. What makes an archdiocese compared to a diocese is population typically, or historical significance. So for those of you who know, St. Louis actually is very historically significant to the Catholic Church, right? We were like the third diocese ever founded in this country. At one point, we covered not only here in St. Louis, but the entire western part of the country, all the way up to Washington. That was our diocese. And we have a rather large Catholic population here. St. Louis is called the Rome of the West for a good reason, right? So we have an archbishop because of that. Now, that wasn't established until the 1850s. Before that, we were a diocese, and we broke away actually from Quebec. So it's all. So that's kind of the significance. A cardinal then, so again, archbishop, bishop, no difference except for the title, right? The honor. Then a cardinal. What's a cardinal? A little red bird. True.
But they wear red.
Well,
That's what I was thinking.
well,
too.
here's
Like,
interesting,
those
right?
were red.
Amelia.
So actually, the cardinals were named after the priests.
That's right.
When they came to the New World, they looked like the red robes of the priests wore, so then they called them cardinals.
Yeah, you know, cardinals are native of the United States, North America. And so when the settlers came here, they saw these red birds like, oh, because they know, especially here in the Midwest. And the Jesuits founded this area, right? Catholic priests. And they saw these red birds and like, well, they're prelates over in Rome, we're gonna call them cardinals. But cardinal is a Latin term, all it really means is hinge. What's a hinge do? A hinge supports, right? Supports a door. Who's the door? The Pope. Right? So cardinals are supporters, advisors to the Holy Father. Now, what makes it interesting is, does a cardinal have to be a man? No,
Has there ever been a female cardinal?
no. But John Paul II apparently asked Mother Teresa to be a cardinal. And she said no, because that would take her away from her mission to the poor dying. Right?
But if women can't be deacons, priests, yada, 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 then how could they be a cardinal?
Well, because a cardinal is an honorary title, and all it really means you're advising to the Pope, right?
I'm not like a pastor.
No, you don't have to be, ordained to be a cardinal. Now, you have to be ordained in order to become the Pope. And that raises some very interesting issues. So let's say you had women cardinals and they're under the age of 80. Could they elect the Pope? Sure. But the Pope has to be a Pope has to be able to be ordained a bishop. That can only be a man.
He doesn't have to be a bishop, he just has to
Be able to be ordained, the capacity for that, yes.
So if you're a male and you're in good standing with the Catholic Church.
Right. Well, in order to be the Pope, the only requirement is you're a Catholic man. That's it,
Well, you hope that we're in good standing. Right.
ideally. But if we understand the Pope is elected by act of the Holy Spirit through the cardinals, then as long as they're a Catholic man, okay.
So we could have a Catholic pope who was married.
Correct. But they would then have to be ordained to the diaconate, priesthood, episcopacy. Because you don't have to be, we'll talk about this, holy orders. Marriage is not essential to the priesthood. It's a discipline of it. And we'll talk about that when we talk about holy orders. So just keep that in mind. Yes, Amelia.
Doesn't the Pope get to choose the cardinals or something?
He does. Okay, so we have this hierarchy, right? The church also is one holy Catholic and apostolic. So we're unified, right? If you go to church here in St. Louis or church in Japan, it's the same mass, the same belief, the same structure, right? We're holy. It's not the people that make the church holy. It's not the priest or the bishop or the pope that makes the church holy. It's the Holy Spirit that makes the church holy. Which is why, as a minister, the grace given in the sacrament is not based on the minister's holiness. If that were the case, we'd all be in trouble, right? It's based on the Holy Spirit acting in it. Okay. Catholic. What does Catholic mean?
Universal.
Universal. So many other denominations may actually proclaim the same creed, the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed. The understanding, though, is, well, what does that Catholic mean? Is that a big C Catholic or a small c Catholic, right? We understand it as a big C Catholic, right? We are a universal church, which means we actually spread through all cultures, all peoples, all nationalities, all ideologies. It's all over the world. It's universal. And that also provides unity in that, right? And finally, what kind of brings us all home is apostolic. It was founded by Jesus Christ himself, who was handed down through the apostles. And that hierarchy has been established and promulgated throughout all time since its founding by Jesus himself. Good. Who founded it? Jesus. Jesus is the founder of the Catholic Church. And that's unique because other faiths can't claim that they were actually founded by God.
Don't
Right.
the Orthodox claim that though?
Well, the Orthodox do, but we would say they're also one holy Catholic and apostolic. They are a sister church. There's not a lot of difference between the Catholics and the Orthodox, except, and we're going to find this now, even with the understanding of the Pope. That was a big dividing point. That and what we call the filioque, but that's another situation. a lot of these have been overcome more recently. Unfortunately, though, I'm just going to try to keep that time. Unfortunately, there was a split within the Orthodox churches that kind of kept us from combining. There actually was a thought that within a few more years, we'd actually unified again after 1,000 years of separation. But we've gotten to the point now where if you went down the street to St. Thomas Orthodox Church, a Catholic could receive the Eucharist over there. We have no restriction on that. Or if an Orthodox came to our church, they're free to receive the sacraments from our church. Cool. Now we would say you probably shouldn't though, unless you get permission, because they may have a particular issue with us doing that. But from a Catholic perspective, we're saying it's both and, either or.
So all the other churches who, I guess they don't call it the Eucharist, or I guess I'm confused. That's Jesus?
In the Orthodox, sure, they have they're one Holy Catholic and Apostolic too, just like we are. Right? They have a valid priesthood. They have valid sacraments.
And what church is this?
These are all the Orthodox churches.
Orthodox.
So
churches.
Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox,
Oh. okay.
Ukrainian Orthodox, all these different Orthodox churches. Because every Orthodox church has a corresponding Catholic church too. That if you were to go to one of the Orthodox services and go to the Catholic service that corresponds to it, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
Do they do the consecration?
Of course, yeah.
I feel like, is it the Russian Orthodox that they actually have a prayer that they believe that Satan could be saved? That's like the only difference
Maybe.
I've been
I don't
ever
know,
found.
sure, why not? Why sure? I don't know.
I thought, what an idea.
That is a good idea. I don't know if it has any validity to it, but all right, whatever, fine. But yeah, if you were to a Russian Orthodox church, it would be the same structure we see at a Roman Rite Mass. They have liturgy of the Word, liturgy of the Eucharist. Awesome, right? Good. Why was it founded? What was it for? What purpose? Well, obviously to save souls, right? The purpose of the church is to continue the mission of Jesus Christ to save humanity, right? How is it founded? Well, we talk about that in a human way by Jesus, in a hierarchical way. And when did it start? Well, it started actually during the life of Jesus and didn't actually take over until the Pentecost, right? So Jesus established his church while he was living and then handed over the reins, so to speak, at Pentecost, but gave him the gift of the Holy Spirit to guide it. We call that kind of the birthday of the church. But really the church was established even from the incarnation all the way through. Okay. So that leads to how we actually do these things, right? How do we function then? Well, liturgy. And liturgy, properly speaking, what it means is public work. That comes from an old understanding of in the Roman times, instead of like the government would fund a particular project, they would ask people to maybe supply the means to provide a road or a sewer or an aqueduct, right? And so that person would provide a public work towards the whole. And that's what liturgy means, public work. Okay. So the forms, they're really forms of prayer. So every sacrament is a liturgy. Not every liturgy is a sacrament. The Mass, of course, is a prayer. It's a liturgy. Liturgy of the Hours, which is a prayer that every clergy and consecrated person prays every day, which also corresponds to the Jewish form of prayer, a way of consecrating the day, right? So at certain times, a priest or consecrated will stop and pray psalms and readings and actually consecrate that time of the day to God. But everyone can pray that. No, doesn't have to be priest or consecrated to pray that. Anyone can pray those. Right? Exposition. So we actually take the Blessed Sacrament and expose him to the people, so we can actually adore Jesus in the Eucharistic way. We'll talk about the Eucharist later, right? Blessings. Blessings are forms of liturgies, especially Mass blessings, right? Now this might be like communal prayer. So we have a bunch of people that gather to pray the Rosary or the Divine
Mercy.
Divine Mercy. Oh, right, also Divine Mercy. Are those liturgies?
No.
Yeah, I don't either. It's kind of some people. I mean, the fact that it's public work, that's true, but it could be right. but primarily they're devotional. And not all devotionals are typically liturgies. But there is an argument made when you gather communally to pray those together. Yeah, that could be a liturgy, right? There's an act of worship, there's an act of service going on in those things.
But all the others have authority, i.e. the priest.
Let's be careful how we use that word, right? They have authority in the fact that there's a grace being given, or at least a fostering of grace given in those aspects, right? So like blessings, for instance. There's not actually a channel of grace and blessings. If I give you a blessing, Kate, I'm not giving you a particular grace in that blessing. What a blessing does, and we also understand this what sacramentals do, we'll talk about that later too. Sacramentals are a way of fostering ourselves to receive grace in a deeper way.
To open me up.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
So not actually giving grace in some respect, they're actually fostering a deeper reception of it.
Okay.
Okay. So could devotionals do that too? Of course they could. And if they're done in a communal way, okay, well, maybe that could be a liturgy, maybe not. All right. Questions about that? Wonderful.
What was the exposition again?
So that's, we call that adoration, right? So particular parts of the day or the year or the month or the week, we actually take the Eucharist and put it in what we call, and we'll just when we go for the tour, we expose Jesus on the altar so we can actually adore him.
Okay.
Okay. And then we actually do a blessing at the end too, called a benediction. All right, great. Vatican II. Before we start talking about Vatican II, let's go ahead and watch a little video. Oh, wait, am I sharing this? Well, I guess I'm not sharing this. Hold on. Let me share this a little bit too. Sorry, Rachel, I thought I was sharing this, but apparently I wasn't. That's okay.
That's okay. I followed.
Okay, good.
The Second Vatican Council is often misunderstood and can elicit a wide variety of reactions. Some credit it with bringing the church into the modern era. Others believe that it's the reason for many of the changes that have removed significant aspects of tradition and is ultimately responsible for the falling away of so many from the faith. On this 60th anniversary of the opening of the Second Vatican Council, we wanted to dive deeper and see what the main takeaways were of the council. So we sat down with Father John Watt, professor at Rome's Pontifical University of the Holy Cross.
Father John Watt, it's great to see you and thank you very much for giving us your time.
Good to be here today.
Bring us back and remind us of why was this council called and how momentous was this occasion?
I think in order to understand the council, you have to think of the situation of especially Europe and the church after the two world wars of the first part of the century. So there was a sense that we're starting again. And in the late 1950s, the wars were over. And the church was looking around at the world and saying, we need to begin again in our relationship with the world that's the new world that we find ourselves living in. And the church obviously has been around for 2,000 years, but there's a sense that this is a new epoch that's beginning. And we need to adjust ourselves, open ourselves to the new reality of the world today.
What were some of the challenges that they were trying to address, or problems they were trying to fix? Because as you said, post-World War II, the world had peace, what it longed for. And the church, kind of in those decades, was at a golden age, great attendance, lots of seminarians coming in. So what was the problem?
The council wasn't really about addressing challenges. It was about taking advantage of opportunities. I think the peacetime after the world wars was seen as a golden opportunity for the church to engage with the world. And the church was blessed with many vocations at that time. There were great artists and intellectuals who were Catholic, living and active in that period. And I think the council is actually a product of not concern about challenges, but of optimism about opportunities. Well, a key part of the message of Lumen Gentium, that dogmatic constitution of the church, was chapter 5, which is about the universal call to holiness. And the idea was that every single Christian, by virtue of being baptized, was actually called to the perfection of charity and the perfection of the fullness of the Christian life, is holiness.
Father John, why do you think it still is today that many Catholics around the world look at the Second Vatican Council? Some embrace the spirit of it, while others still look at it with suspicion.
But I think if you read the documents of the council, you'll come away with a very different impression than you would get from the way people talk about the council. The way the council was presented in the media, from the council dovetailed with a cultural revolution in society that also affected the life of the church. And so it's very hard, I think, for people to separate out what is exactly the council and what is the implementation of the council, the consequences in society and in the church after the council. Are those caused by the council? Are they coincidence? Or it all goes together as sort of the 1960s and 70s, which was a very traumatic time, because after that great period of hope in the 50s I was talking about, but we're going to be engaged with the modern world, it seemed like the modern world was running roughshod over the church, and priests and nuns were leaving their vocations, and there was a drop in vocations to the priesthood. There was doctrinal confusion. There was protest against the traditional teachings of the church about sexuality, for instance, in Mani Vitae. All of that happened at once, and it's not in the text of the council that the problem is really after the council.
This was happening in society at large when so many things were kind of up for grabs throughout these decades. And you mentioned the media coverage, which is fascinating around the Second Vatican Council, because we know today, unfortunately, with a very polarized news media in many parts of the world, particularly the United States. But this was even the case back then, wasn't it? When we kind of saw for the first time this divide, where did you stand as a church, how it was interpreted, and also the people involved, the cardinals and so on, were put into different brackets, kind of for the first time publicly.
The Second Vatican Council was the first television era council, first radio era as well, but it was the first council that was conducted in a context of modern media coverage. Constant daily reporting was possible, and it was quite natural that people would take advantage of that. People had their own agenda, what they thought the church should be doing or where the church should be going, and it wasn't just the media. I mean, sometimes people blame the media for the misinterpretation of the council, but the media was being used by people often in the council. In other words, not necessarily cardinals or bishops, but frequently the people around them, the so-called periti, the experts, they would have informal press conferences, basically guiding the media coverage to the counselors, to the fathers of the council. They were counselors to them. They had their ideas and their agenda, and they were selling that to the journalists. So in a certain sense, you could say that the journalists were actually being used by people in the council, right? It wasn't simply the media, the outside media was to blame for mishandling the council. They were being guided also by people within the council.
Father John Walker, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
So I think this is important to recognize when we talk about the Second Vatican Council. So that was the most recent council we had as a church. And it really did kind of have some huge impact, right? And as Father was saying, it did certain things that maybe we see now today that wasn't before 1965 or 1970. Like, for instance, use of vernacular in the liturgy, right? Use of like English, used to be in Latin. But what misunderstood there is that, the church didn't say we should get rid of Latin completely. What it said was it's good to actually learn what's going on in the new Mass. We have a new way of doing things in the Mass, so people can understand what's going on, but the intention was always go back to Latin, right? Because Latin is the mother tongue of the church. Things like not eating meat on Friday, right? That was a tradition of the church that really dated back to the Middle Ages. And why is that? Well, it's a way of sacrificing, right, to God. Kind of in a way, when Jesus gives his own sacrifice on the cross, we can sacrifice in small ways to kind of, receive that grace in a deeper sense. After Vatican II was there was less of a restriction on that. But what it said was if you eat meat on Friday, especially, well, Fridays outside of Lent, especially, Fridays during Lent still maintain that tradition. But outside of Lent, okay, well, if you want to have a hamburger on Friday, fine, but you should probably do some other form of penance. That kind of got lost in the shuffle. A lot of these things that we see today, like, oh, the Vatican II did this and this. Well, as Father said, a lot of those people who are spouting those things never actually read any of the documents from Vatican II. And if you read a lot of the documents, even though there are some levels of allowances given, it didn't really change a whole lot. But there was a spirit of the council compared to what the council actually did, right? And it was happening in the 60s where there's a lot of turmoil, there was a lot of debates, there was a lot of protests going on, and a lot of people projected that onto the church. And because it was open to the media, you had a lot of these things discussed. So in prior councils, what would happen is the bishop would come together, they would talk about these different issues openly and honestly, they would debate them back and forth. They would vote on them. They would write up a document and send it to the Pope. And once the Pope promulgated that, that became the dogma or the doctrine of the church. Usually in other councils, you didn't have insight to what was going on internally, right? Who was saying what about what or whatever. With Vatican II, you had a daily update about who was saying what about what. So things about priestly celibacy, allowances for women to be ordained, homosexuality and what how that's all about, right? Contraception. These things are being discussed at the council, but nothing was being concluded. It was being promulgated was, oh yeah, the church is going to change all these things. We're going to have women come to the seminaries. We're going to have, gay priests maybe. We'll have, married priests finally. Well, none of that was true. But because it already got out into the water, you couldn't contain it anymore. And the effects of that, what happened a lot of times was you had people entering convents and monasteries thinking, oh, well, I'll be able to become a priest or get married or whatever. And when it didn't happen, we had a kind of a mass exodus from those areas. Vocations dropped precipitously, right? And we had some issues with priests and deacons and bishops and sisters that they were manifesting those maybe internal desires in really bad ways. 20 years ago, it came to fruition. We call the sexual abuse crisis, right? And that was stemmed from this misconception of what the church is actually doing. That's one of the issues, not the only one, but that was one of them that kind of started this whole process going, right? The other thing that the church really promoted was this understanding of active participation. So it's important to understand what that is. Active participation is not activism. It's not like everyone should have a role in the liturgy, right? Active participation is an internal disposition towards what's happening. It's a disposition of prayer, right? And we even see that physically in many ways in the Mass, right? We have these different positions we take depending on what's going on, right? So for instance, when we're learning, we're sitting, right? We're learning from the priest or learning from the readings, we're sitting down to receive those things well. That's the position of a learner. When we honor something, we stand. The words of Jesus in the gospel, we stand up for that, to honor that, right? And when God is truly present, we kneel. That when Jesus comes about on the altar in the Eucharist, we kneel in the presence of God.
I understand all that.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my struggle is, and maybe it's just still my pride, but I cannot kneel yet.
Well, okay, so yeah. So also too, though, another valid way of disposition during that time is sitting.
Right.
And that's really reserved for those who maybe can't kneel.
Okay.
Right. So that's okay too. The idea though is that you're lower than Jesus.
Right.
Right. That's kind of the idea there behind
But
that.
I think my question is, and I'm not going to use if, but when and if I am accepted into the Catholic faith, then does it become an obligation if I'm physically able?
Yes.
Okay.
Because we kneel in the presence of God,
Right.
right? And we understand, and then we'll talk about the Eucharist. We believe the Eucharist actually is Jesus.
Right.
And so Jesus being God, we worship him with due reverence and respect.
And I think that's why I'm realizing just how prideful I can be. But I'm thinking specifically about kneeling, that is why I'm not yet kneeling.
That could be,
Because-
that's fine. You can struggle with that, Kate. That's okay.
Okay,
Right? That's okay. Right? You don't have to be there now, or even after you're actually receiving the church, right? You don't have to be there then. But in order to actually receive the Eucharist validly, you have to have that belief that actually is Jesus.
right.
Right? And so that should conform the way we actually approach the altar and the way we do things too. And we'll get to that. We'll talk about that later. Okay. We already talked about Latin vernacular. TLM, the traditional Latin Mass compared to what we call the Novus Ordo, right? So there actually are 3 places still in St. Louis where the traditional Latin Mass is celebrated. St. Francis de Sales on Gravois, the Oratory of Gregory and Augustine, which is over at St. Luke's in Richmond Heights, and up north, St. Barnabas in St. Charles. So if you ever wanted to go to those Masses, you're more than welcome to go to those. It's all in Latin.
Do they do a homily in Latin too?
No, not usually, but usually there's no homily.
Oh, okay.
So the traditional Latin Mass is the same structure, liturgy of the word, liturgy of the Eucharist, but it's done a little bit differently. And if you didn't really know any better, you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference, but there are different investments, there's different actions that you would not see at the Mass we celebrate here at St. Gabriel. But also, if I wanted to this morning, could I celebrate the Mass over here completely in Latin? Yes, I could. That's still the mother tongue of the church. Will I? Probably not, because people don't know Latin. And we got this kind of circular logic, right? So after the council, another one of these misconceptions is, oh, we don't need Latin anymore, right? So we kind of stopped teaching it. And why do we stop teaching it? Well, we're not using Latin. We're not using the Mass anymore. Why are we using Latin in the Mass anymore? We're not teaching it, right? So we got to get this kind of circular logic of like, well, we're not using it, so we're not going to teach it. We're not going to teach it because we're not using it. But the Vatican Council is very clear that that was not the intention, right? Which is why I have Latin classes every Sunday. And why I actually do some of the Masses in Latin during the week if I'm available, right?
Do they teach Latin in the seminaries?
Yes.
So the end result is that once you become or are in the process of becoming ordained, you have to learn that in order to.
Well, I should say that is a requirement in our seminary here in St. Louis.
Okay,
I can't say the same for every seminary,
okay,
but Latin is very important to know. Not only that, but also like translation. So we also learn Greek, right? So that we can actually translate the Bible and understand the deeper meaning behind it, right? Because translation betrays meaning, right? So it's good to know these things so we actually be effective preachers and teachers. But yeah, I mean, Latin is a good thing to know.
is there only one seminary here? I'm sorry,
In St. Louis, yes.
and that's Kenrick?
Yes. But we're also one of few dioceses that actually have a seminary. That's very uncommon for a diocese to have a seminary.
Wasn't the Bible originally written in Hebrew though? Is there any emphasis?
Well, yes, the Old Testament was, yes. So the Old Testament was actually translated from Hebrew into Greek. And the New Testament was written primarily in Greek. Then that was all translated into Latin by St. Jerome in the 3rd century, 4th century. And then after, over time, especially with like Gutenberg and the printing press, it was translated in other different languages.
So why the reverence for Latin over Greek?
Well, Latin, because we're the Roman Rite Church. So like if you were to go to, in some places actually Greek is actually the main language. So for instance, if you went to what we call a Byzantine Mass, that's a Catholic Mass, but it's actually all in Greek. Because we have these different, what we call rites of the church, R-I-T-E-S, we're the Latin Rite, or the Roman Rite. So we came from Rome, right, which spoke Latin.
Is this back to the split of the East and the West?
No, this actually predates that. We're talking about the finding of Jesus. When the apostles went out and founded new churches, they would use the actual, wording of the people there. So Jesus spoke Aramaic, right?
Right.
We have actually a rite in the Catholic Church called the Chaldean Rite. which actually is all spoken in Aramaic. It's Catholic, it's all Catholic, it's all under the church, but it's a different culture and tradition in those particular churches. Because we're the Roman Catholic Church, our mother language is Latin.
Okay.
Okay,
Palestinian Christians
yes,
fall under where?
I think they're Chaldean,
Okay,
yeah.
same with Egyptian Christians and,
Well, Egyptian might be, they may be Coptic Catholic. Again, it's, every time you have an Orthodox, you have a corresponding
right.
Catholic one too,
understand.
right?
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Very briefly, one of the big differences between Vatican II and other councils were there were no anathemas, right? So every council said, hey, in order to establish doctrine, if you don't believe a doctrine, if you don't believe this, you're not part of the church. Vatican II didn't do that. It was considered more of a pastoral council, right? How to bring people in, how to interact with people, and also give us understanding of maybe more of what the role of the clergy would be and laity. So it actually opened up more access to the laity to actually be part of the liturgies, be part of the governance of the church, making more decisions, which is a great thing. We all need that, right? There also, unfortunately, was maybe some differences when we talk about architecture. For instance, in the Novus Ordo, you notice that the altar is away from the tabernacle, right? Before 1965, the tabernacle and the altar were together. The priest would celebrate mass facing the tabernacle, not the people, right? There was nothing that was indicated in Vatican II that actually pulled the altar out. Nothing said that, right? It just started happening kind of organically, and no one really said anything about it. So we see these kind of effects of either, allowances, but also what wasn't written by the Church Fathers of Vatican II and what actually was. And so I encourage anyone to go read those. Lumen Gentium, Sacrosanctum Concilium, Gaudium et Spes, and I can't remember the last one. But it was about ecumenism. So there are kind of four main doctrines that came from it. And those Latin meanings being Gaudium et Spes just means joy and hope. Sacrosanctum Concilium, this sacred council. The documents always start with the first few words of the actual letter. So whenever you read it, if you don't know what the translation means, just read the first few words of lines, you'll know what it means. Okay. Good. Any questions, comments, concerns, heresies?
The sisters, nuns, monks, brothers, they also all learn Latin when they're going through formation.
Some do, some don't. It kind of depends on what kind of formation they're receiving. A lot of that's determined by the particular order. So not necessarily. Depends on what their charism would be. But I think many still do. All right, good. Well, we'll go up to Mass, and if there are any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we'll have Mass and we'll have our tour right after Mass, okay?
When you are not going to take communion, you go up